All right, so I'm going to try to do this crazy thing of building a really complex app in like no time at all, 45 minutes or so. And what my goal really is today is not to teach you all these technologies in depth, but to show you them in working together. So you already heard my bio. I wrote this crazy book. It's really big. As a matter of fact, I wrote it twice because, you know, I was bored. It's like 900 pages. And this second edition is on Entity Framework 4. So here's why I came up with this talk. And I do this sometimes myself too. A lot of times you'll go to presentations or read articles that teach you about a technology, but they teach it in a vacuum. I teach things about Entity Framework, and sometimes I just use a console app or unit tests to demonstrate what it is that I'm talking about. And oftentimes you'll see this if somebody's talking about Windows Azure, you see that by itself, or SQL Azure, etc. So what I want to do is put them all together in more of a realistic application, all right? And what I want to do is create an application that's completely hosted in the cloud. So I don't want to spend too much time explaining what, you know, again, like teaching you about Entity Framework, teaching you about OData, but I do want to give you at least an overview of what each of these pieces are that we're working with. So SQL Azure is Microsoft's relational database in the cloud. Okay, so it's very similar. It's almost SQL Server in the cloud, but many of the things, there are things in SQL Server features that don't make sense for a data service, so it doesn't support some of those kinds of things. But essentially, it's SQL Server in the cloud. Windows Azure in the cloud, if you were just here, Clemens is a pretty big Azure and cloud guru, that's for sure. But Windows Azure in the cloud is basically for processing. Okay, so for hosting the application. So applications in Azure and other types of services as well that it provides, and data, relational data in SQL Azure. So I'm going to create an MVC application that runs in Azure, that's hosted by Azure. I'm going to create a service, are you familiar with WCF data services that return OData? So rather than this being simply a WCF data service, this will be an Azure data service because the data service will live in the cloud. So I'm going to and the data service will spit out OData, which will be consumed by the MVC app, and I'm going to use MVC3. And behind the OData service, the data service, I'll use Entity Framework, and just because it's so much fun to do, I'm using the brand new version, not the version, but the brand new piece of Entity Framework that got added to it, which was Entity Framework 4.1, which was recently released, that contains code first, and it also contains a new context, the DB context. Is anybody familiar with that? Has anybody been using them yet? Whoa, okay, so you see all kinds of new technologies smushed together, right? So I'll be going quickly through some of those pieces. Again, you can go back and learn about Entity Framework and learn about MVC, but I want you to see that the whole point of these things is that they're built to work together. So here's what I plan to do in this short time. I'm going to create a model and a context using Entity Framework 4.1, and I'm going to use a local database for the development and testing, right? I'm not going to go right up to SQL Azure. As a matter of fact, my intention had been to eventually switch to my SQL Azure database, but you may have noticed that the internet is not really terribly reliable today, and I don't want to be in the middle of that and have it keep messing up what I'm doing. So I'll probably not lean on an actual cloud deployment, even though I have this whole thing actually deployed in the cloud. Then I'll take that model and I'll wrap it in the data service, and the data service will expose OData. And the highlighted red things are just, the hot new buzz technologies, right? Then I'll switch the local database to SQL Azure, and that's the part that I think I'm going to skip today because of the internet access. And then I'll create another Azure piece which will host an MVC3 application. Okay? And then the other thing I won't do for two reasons is literally publish this. This would obviously be the next step. I'll show you what it looks like, but I won't do the actual deed. Two reasons. One, the internet. Then second is it typically takes about 10 to 12 minutes to deploy an Azure project. So, who's got time for that? And that's really, that is such a drag when you're testing and it doesn't work and you have to deploy it over and over and over again. Has anybody been through that? Deploying any Azure projects yet? Okay. So if you haven't seen any of these technologies before, just looking to see if there's a mouse pad under there, better than a piece of paper. Nope. Okay. So you'll get a good overview of each of them. So the first thing I'm going to do, if I don't have one running already, no. The first thing I'm going to do, and this is important, is I'm going to start Visual Studio as an administrator. Okay? And if you're trying to do this, if you're creating these Azure projects and you forgot that step, you'll learn that you need to do that when you try to run it. When you try to run it and Visual Studio tries to start running all of the emulators, the local emulators that emulate what the cloud is like, it'll say, oh, you're not running as administrator, you're going to have to shut down and restart as administrator. So the first thing I'm going to do is create the model. And as a matter of fact, my classes that are going to be the core of everything, my domain classes and the context. I'll start with the classes. So I have to have some project working. So I'll start by saying, all right, I'll go ahead and create the first piece of this is going to be the data service hosted in the cloud. So I have the Visual Studio tools for Azure, or the Azure tools for Visual Studio already installed. So that's why I'm able to do this. So I'm going to start a cloud project. And I better call this services host so I know which one is which. So that's the project. This isn't like the normal way of creating a project in Visual Studio. Now that I have a hosting project, the question is, what is it that you want to host? Right? Some kind of a role. So what I want to host is, well, I want to host something that I can create a data service inside of. A data service is not a project. It just needs to be inside of some kind of web-enabled project. So I could choose an ASP.NET website. I could choose MVC3. I could choose a WCF service. Any one of those will work because they all will give me something to have my data service inside of, because data service is an item, not a project. So I'll just pick the web role. That's random. And actually, making that choice might be about what's the easiest thing to clean up, right? Because the ASP.NET web role, now I've just created a project filled with all kinds of ASP.NET web application stuff that I don't want to use and I'm going to have to delete. Frankly, I'm just going to ignore them and I'll create my data service inside of there. Now my data service, before I create my data service, now I can go ahead and add my, let's see, where did I put it? Somewhere I could get at it. Okay, there's my domain classes. I could have just put a reference to this instead of adding it in, but I just wanted you just to see the classes because I'm going to use code first. Code first is the new entity framework. The entity framework, if you're used to working with it, you start with some kind of model, an entity data model, which you either create by reverse engineering a database, or you can create a model right in the designer and then generate the database from that. Okay? And also, entity framework does code generation from the model, which creates your domain classes. All right? So this is a third way to do it. This is one that doesn't involve a physical model at all. I'm just going to create classes and let this new piece of Entity Framework technology called Code First take care of all the rest for me. All right, so all I have there is, well, almost all the rest. So all I have here is these couple of simple classes. Nice, they're the way I want them. I'm not depending on a code generator to create my classes for me. Now I want to create a WCF data service, and I'm going to do that. Now you see I've got 3 projects. I just want to point this out. I've got the host. That's the Azure project that hosts the web role, and this is the web role. And the web role is an ASP.NET project, and I'm going to add a data service inside of there. And the easiest way to find these things is data service. Okay, and this is all about blog, so I'll call this blog data service. Okay, so I'm not going to really care about all the other stuff in there. All the other, the web pages and the ASPX pages and global ASX. I'm just gonna ignore them completely. Now, because I'm using Code First, again, this is going to be a lot of information. Because I'm using Code First, the WCF Data Services team had to make WCF Data Services aware of Code First. They had to tweak the data services so that it works. They also work with Code First. All right, so that's something new. And there's a CTP. Are you familiar with Community Technical Preview? Of that I downloaded and installed. So I have newer bits that are aware of that. So if you're using the defaults, it won't work with Code First. So I have newer assemblies and newer SDK so that WCF Data Services will understand Entity Framework 4.1. And one of the things that I need to do because of that is I have to get rid of the original ones that were pulled into this project, that's System Data Services and System Data Services Client. And I need to add in those new files that I installed. So they're called Microsoft Data Services and Microsoft Data Services Clients. And that's the naming convention Microsoft usually used for things that are CTPs. They're not released yet. So eventually, these will become the real system.dataservices, etc., DLLs. So again, this little piece is just so that I can use the new Code First. If I was using straight Entity Framework with an entity data model, I wouldn't have to do this little bit. The other thing I have to do is make this aware of Code First itself. So I'm just adding in the new, this is the new assembly, entityframework.dll. This is the new assembly that goes with Entity Framework 4.1 and Entity Framework Code First. Okay, so now I've got what I need for my data service, but now I need the data service to be able to work with the domain classes. Okay, I've got my service and I've got my classes, but I need a bridge in between. And what I need in between is a context from Entity Framework, which will manage the classes. And that's what Data Services expects me to give it, something that will provide the classes. So I have to create the context. And I'm going to do that, this is another, I'm going to just pop it in here because there's just not enough time in the day. Here it is. I've already coded this one up. It's actually in the class 1 file, which is silly. So here's the context class. Now we're getting back to Code First, Entity Framework Code First. This is the context that's going to manage my classes, and then the data service is going to talk to the context. So I'm building all these layers. All right. So this context provides blogs and posts. And it also has some initialization information. Now, this is a really cool thing. Entity Framework, or Code First, starts with a code, and then you have the option of letting Code First automatically create a database for you. Okay? You can tell Code First, you can point Code First to an existing database, but I'm going to let it automatically create a database for me. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to change this context. No, I'm going to leave this to be called model context. And when it does that, I've created this initializer. I would love to do a whole talk on just Entity Framework 4.1, but I can't. But I've got this initializer that says, when you create the database for me, here's some initial data to throw in there. So this is great when you're building an application and you just want to have some sample data. You might change the model so the database gets recreated, so you can make sure that it just automatically knows whenever it recreates the data. Code first recreates the database, it'll push the data in there. So now that I have a manager of the classes, I can tell the service about those. Let me just go ahead and build everything. So, hey, rebuild all failed. Okay, that's because I still have to build the service. All right, so now I can tell the service about it. First, I need to, this is the service project. I need to add a reference to that context so I can use it. And now I'm going to go over here and throw that context. I'm going to say the service is serving up whatever that context is managing. So I'll say model context. It doesn't know what it is. And it's in my data access layer. So the service is exposing whatever the model context is managing. And the model context is managing the blogs and the posts. Good so far? Now, the service is locked down by default whenever you create a data service. And what that means is, if I ran the data service, it would say, it wouldn't tell me that it provides blogs and posts. By default, it says, I'm not going to let anybody know anything about it unless you want me to. So what I'm going to do is come down here. They put all these notes in, so you have a clue to get started if you don't feel like going and reading all the documentation. And I'm going to set an entity set access rule. I have two entity sets. I have blogs and I have posts. And I'm just going, so what I would do here is I could say I only want the blogs to be read, or I only want the posts to be read, but I'm just going to say just let everything. Let the service read everything, but just read, right? There's no updating in there. I'm just saying this is just for display only. I could change that. I could actually put lots of different rules in there and build a complex set of rules for what is able to be read and what's able to be written and deleted and added. So I'm glad nobody's wildly taking notes, because that's not the idea. I hope you just let it all flow over you just so you can see all of these things and have an idea about them. Okay. Now, this should be everything I need to do. I'm thinking, so many pieces of this puzzle. And I don't have a database, and I don't have a database connection string. By default, if I haven't given a database connection string to code first, it's going to look in SQL Express for a database with the same strongly typed name as my model. So it's going to look for dal.modelContext in SQL Express. If it doesn't find it, it will create it. Otherwise, I have to explicitly give it a database connection string, and then it will use that. It will still create the guts of the database, the schema, and populate the data for me, but if I don't want it to use the SQL Express default, then I can tell it what I want it to use. But I'm just going to let it use the default. I'm going to start, just because it's safe for making sure things are working properly, rather than start by testing the Azure project to make sure that all runs, first I just want to make sure the service runs. So I'm going to go down to the service and view that in the browser. Cross my fingers. They taught you this in Comp Sci class, right? This part of the programming process? Yes. Okay. So what this is saying is I have a service that's going to show you all of these things. Notice there's another entity set there. EDM metadatas. that is a clue to me that Code First has already created the database for me. Because Code First creates all the tables based on the classes I defined, blog and post, and it also creates a metadata table. So the fact that this knows about the metadata table means that it's reading the database, and the database is already created. Okay? Now, let's see what's inside of there. Make this a little wider. Look, I'm so bleeding edge. I even have Internet Explorer 9 on here. Am I in Internet, or am I in? Yeah, I also have Chrome. I'm a very diplomatic person. Yes. Don't you? Isn't it always every step of the way, right? Like, and I've got so many millions of steps here. Okay, so there's the data that I pushed in with the seed data, and there's so much more that I can do with the seed data, but I'm not gonna worry about that. But this isn't a promotional spot or an advertisement, but I just did a series of 10 videos. They're about 5 or 10 minutes long each, and each of them has an article, short, like 2,500 word article for MSDN. So they're on MSDN online, they're free, and they're all about Code First and the DB Context and Entity Framework 4.1. I even did a whole video on the initialization, on the seeding of the data and how the initialization works. So those are short's good, right? Short and sweet, so you can just get the idea of things. So yay, that works. That's just running the service on its own, not depending on the Azure emulator, right? The Azure emulator in my computer that's going to act like it's the actual cloud. So now I'm going to try to see if it will run inside of there. So now I'm going to go from the services host, that's my Azure project that's containing this project, and I'm just going to run it, and we'll see what happens. It's not going to work. All the good information is down in the lower left-hand corner. See, it's saying running package. It said first packaging the deployment, then it said running the deployment, and I don't remember putting a breakpoint there. Is it about to give me a bad error? No. Okay. Oh! Do you know why that's happening? That's the default page. But there's another thing. I just want you to see it, because when you start, if there's a point when you start moving into this stuff, I just got to make this the default. Set as start page. There's another problem. Running. It's a brand new computer, so much faster than the older one. SSD drive, and still it's too slow. Okay, so that is totally not helpful. And you have to do a lot of learning that I don't even know how to do yet. I know how to learn, I just don't know how to do this. You can actually do tracing and logging and everything in here. It's really, really complicated for me. So luckily you guys are all probably a lot smarter with that stuff. So what I know the problem is, and I want you to know, it cost me a lot of hours to figure this out. Nobody told me. I just finally came across it. Is that Azure doesn't like that default database initialization. It doesn't like SQL Express. So what I'm going to do, and I'm sure I could write a connection string all by myself because I've done so many in my life, but I'm not taking a chance. I'm going to copy and paste it. I'm going to force it to use SQL Server. And again, I would love to just say, just go right to where are we? Just go right to my SQL Azure, but I'm not going to because, like I said, the internet. Oh, of course, now the internet looks great. It's tempting, very, very tempting. So here's connection strings. Let me add my connection string in there. So this is model context is the name I want. I'm just saying use my regular SQL Server instance. And here, let's call it something different. GIDS 11. Here is SQL Server. I will refresh it. You can see nothing up my sleeves, nothing behind the screen. There's no GIDS 11 Azure database there. Now I don't have a good answer on that one. Let's see. It didn't create it. What am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? Say it again? Okay. Now, there's something wiggy with my, I think there's something funny with my, is there suddenly a security? All right. Let's just grab the connection string of, this is running. Let me just make sure all these are working. I do know 100% that the first problem that it was showing me was because of the SQL Express. I wonder if I just literally, if I don't use the, let's go to the Server Explorer. Okay, it's a Azure, we're renaming this to Azure Debugging Session. Data connection, add connection. Oh, I hate when I do that by mistake. You know, it's going to check the whole internet to see if there's one. Log context Azure. So I'm going to use this connection string. I don't think this is any different. How they fit together, even if they're not friends today. So what happens is this host is now going to be my service, and what I would do is, if there was internet, is deploy this to the web, okay? And I'll show you what the publish looks like, but I'm not going to run it because, again, it takes 12 minutes and we got all these problems. So I'm choosing publish. What you need to do is create some credentials. It will walk you through creating credentials on your machine if you don't have them. And then it's looking on Azure. Again, the internet's really slow. It's looking on Azure in my Azure. No, it's not there. It's looking in my Azure hosted services to see a list of the services I've already created in Azure. And then I would just say which one I want to deploy that to. Oh, there it is. So I could put it into any one of these things, probably a staging project. And then I click on OK, and it goes through the whole deployment and puts it up there, and then gives you, you've seen the cloudapp.net URLs. So you'll get actually an IP, like a long GUID, and then cloudapp.net, and also you have provided in Azure, you provide a regular name. I could say, like, Julie's service, whatever, .cloudapp.net, and that's what you would get in the end. So with everything working and with the SQL Server, stupid thing. So the next step. But that's really all there is. The data service and the code first, right? Those all worked. And then the next step is letting the Azure project host the data service. And there's clearly there's something weird going on with my server, because I've done this like a million times. So that, just be aware that if you're using code first, it's SQL Express that will fail. SQL Server works, right? It does work, and that's something you'll have to do. And it's an interesting thing because you wouldn't notice the difference when you go from just browsing the service directly to trying to host it in the Azure project. There's no information about that. You wouldn't know that it was a SQL Express unless you already knew Azure doesn't like SQL Express. Okay, so the next piece is a new project, and the new project is going to be an MVC3 cloud project. So again, instead of creating an MVC3 project, I'm going to create a new project. It's going to be cloud, and this one will be Azure MVC host. Again, and then again, it's going to say what kind of a web role do you want me to host. So this time, I'm going to use what we call a Franken build. Okay? Who here does MVC3? The Windows Azure tooling does not have an item yet for MVC3. So Jason Halley created one for me. All right? So that's what this one is here. So if it's on his website, jasonhalley, HALEY.com blog, and he actually put it in a blog post on his website, and with instructions of how to install it. So I can actually now create an ASP.NET3 project instead of an MVC3 project instead of an MVC2 project. So that's where that comes from. You won't see it by default in there. Okay, so I get the same couple of things happening. I'm getting the web role, which is my MVC project, and the host, which is somewhere in here, up here on the top. So there's the host, and there's the project web role. Now, if I went ahead and, right now, that web role, that MVC project is just default everything. So I'm just going to run this host, and you can see that the project is working without being attached to my service. And I think because the other Azure service was acting stupid, I'm going to tell this just to consume the service directly rather than for the sake of just getting through this, rather than consuming the Azure piece of it. But when you deploy it, it will be consuming an Azure service, not the service directly. So there's no dependency on SQL Server right now. There, okay, so I'm not running MVC3, I'm running the Azure environment, and the Azure environment is hosting the MVC3 application for me. So that's just MVC3's default. So now what I'm going to do is flip over to one that's coded already. Well, I want to, we'll go over here and look at this. So MVC, a lot of people are not working with it, right? So you're not really familiar with MVC3. And what you will notice is that Microsoft is talking about MVC3 a lot. I can tell you that when I did the Entity Framework videos for them, they wanted MVC3 applications for them. They didn't want console apps, they didn't want WPF or Silverlight, they wanted MVC3. So that's something you're going to see more and more of. MVC stands for, I hope this isn't too redundant for you, Model View Controller. Okay? So the view is the view of what we see, and the model is wherever your data, basically where your data is coming from, what it is that you're displaying, and then the controller is kind of a bridge between the two. All right? So my model is going to be supplied by the service. Right? The model is whatever the service gives me. So I'm not going to go directly to my model context or to my classes. I'm going to say I want the service to provide the model. So the way I'll do that is I'll make a service reference. to the service. Oh, I didn't give it a better name. Oh! I'm in the new project, not the old one. So what I did was create a reference to the blog service. As a matter of fact, I'm going to remove that and use the new one, use the direct one, because that's to the Azure project. And I don't want that if it's not going to be working properly. So, now a lot of times when you see demos, what will happen is you'll see the controller, and the controller is we're doing all the data access. One of the beautiful things about MVC is it lets you separate all of these things that are happening. It's called separation of concerns. Separate all the different roles of the different pieces of your application. And you really don't want to put, it kind of defeats the purpose of what MVC3 is all about. When, to me, it defeats the purpose if you're putting the data access directly in there. So I'm not going to consume the service directly in there. I'm going to consume it in another layer. And I've just created, just for simplicity, I've created a data access class. And what the data access class is it, let me just make sure. Okay. The data access points to the service and creates a context from the service using the data services client. So along with the WCF data services and the ones we're using, the newer WCF data services, Microsoft provides client APIs. So you can design use .NET applications or use them in .NET code, in Silverlight code. They have them for PHP. So you don't have to code against them in a raw way. You don't have to use like JSON and use the URIs directly and things like that. So you can do link queries against them and things, and etc. Okay? So I have a method here where I'm just creating the context. I need to use the context over and over again. I have a bunch of methods here. The first one is get blogs. So it creates an instance of my data service, and then it says from the data service, give me back the blogs as a list. So that's, right, that has nothing to do with my model or my controller or my view. This is just some code that's accessing my context. And I have another one, get blog by ID, takes in an ID, creates the service context again. Notice I'm not relying on keeping that service context instance around. I'm just going to use it, get my data, and throw it away. Or use it, save my data, and throw it away. Okay? So here I'll just get a single blog. And I've also got some code for updating and deleting. Now this code, and I'm not going to drill into this too deeply because of the time, this code is specific. I'm using Entity Framework 4.1 code here. I'm working with the DB context. Oh, no. Back up. That's the next session. This is code. This isn't. This is 3 hours of sleep in 2 days. This is using, because it's really, if you're coding against Entity Framework 4, doing some of this data access looks one way when you're using the object context. If you're using the new DB context Entity Framework 4.1, it's a little different. And when you're using a WCF data context, it's a little different as well. They all kind of look alike, but there are some differences in how they work. But I'm not going to drill into that. That would be the specific WCF data service presentation you can go to. I don't know if there's one here. But I have methods that will use the data service to do some inserts, to do deletes, to modify blogs, or to just get blogs so I can look at them. Now back in the controller, I call this code. It's a lot more fun when I have time to build it all by hand, but it's also kind of overwhelming to see all at once. So one of the controller actions is index. That's kind of the default, just like index with a website is a default. The action will use my data access class to get the blogs from the service that's out of the SQL Azure, that's in the cloud, hitting the SQL Azure database, right? Bring it back and spit it out to the view. And the view for the index, actually, did I create one in here? I'm going to show you what it looks like to create a view. I'm going to copy the, I'll just copy the controller over just so you can see it. Actually, I'll just create it as if it doesn't exist, because it does already exist. See, all my views are in here. If this didn't exist, I'll go ahead and exclude this from the project, so it didn't exist. So if I want to create a view from the controller, Visual Studio has all kinds of tooling specific to MVC3. So the way I do that is I right-click on the view on the controller action that I want to create a view for, and I say Add View, and then I get a wizard. I'm going to leave the name the same because this is the defaults for MVC. I'm using an index controller, so it's going to look for an index view. All right? And I want a strongly typed view based on my blog. So there's the blog class coming out of the blog service. I wanted to create a strongly typed view. And what I wanted to do is show a list of those blog types. So I click on Add. Oh, it didn't like that I was doing that. It didn't like that I hid that project, so I have to rename the folder. Okay, so create the view. Okay, so what it did is, in the views folder in the project, it created a new folder called blog, and it created the index view. I'm using Razor, that's why we have this funny extension, CSHTML. So it just is a view that lists the title and the blogger and name and the date created. So I'm going to take that one back out, and I'm going to put this one back in. So you can at least have seen a little bit of the MVC magic. Now there's a couple of interesting things I'm doing here that are going to be specific to Azure, and I want to show you that. One is specific to Azure, one is specific to the data service, and these are things that stopped me for quite some time until I figured out a good way to do them. So I just want you to see them. So just so as you go down this path, you have these in the back of your mind, and they might seem familiar. One is in the data access class, and notice this bit of code here. When I'm creating the context, the service context, accessing the service, see, I'm using this role environment get configuration setting value. Even though I'm in my role that's being hosted by the service itself, the Azure project, has configuration. You can configure things in the Azure project. So I'm going to go to the project that's hosting my MVC role, which is here. And you see there's these two files. There's a DEF, a definition file, and a CFG configuration file. So in my configuration file, I've created a configuration a setting named Data Service URI, which points to whatever the URI where my service is running. All right. Now, when this is what my URI would look against the emulator, but I'm going to run it, I want to run it directly against my service because the emulator is what's having a problem with the database right now. So I have to get that. So this is, here's my service. I'm going to run it directly. Okay, so there's the URI that I want to use. So the nice thing about this configuration file is, remember I said deploying the Azure project takes a really long time? That's with good internet access, all right? This configuration file, you can just update it in the, wrong one. There's a reason I have that there too. So here's my Azure service, all of my Azure services. That's my account on the internet, okay? So if I've got one of these, here's my different projects I have deployed. And I can go in here and just change that little configuration setting. So I don't have to redeploy the entire thing. So I have this flexibility, whether I'm using the real one online, or if I'm using my emulator, I have the flexibility of, did I copy that so I could paste it? I can just change this very easily. Okay, so now I'm going to point to the direct service. I'm going to cross-make fingers. And we'll go ahead and run it. Because I don't know which it I'm running. If I'm running the MVC3 app, no, I'm running the service. Okay. Might as well see. Yeah, it's still having an issue with the SQL Server because I ran that. So now I'm going to just run the MVC project, the Azure MVC project. What just happened was I was running the Azure project that was hosting the service that's failing because it's having an issue with my SQL database, okay? So I'm going to run the MVC project that's pointing directly to the service that's working. There's the host project. I'll make that the startup project. Now, connecting to the SQL Azure database is simply a matter of changing my database connection string. I'll show you that in the web config file. Please, oh please, work. Thank God. After all that. But again, I'm cheating. I'm cheating because I am pointing directly to the service. I'm not pointing to the Azure hosted service, okay? But that's really simply a matter of the Azure right now is just it's being really cranky about my SQL Server instance, something on my computer that's acting funny. So if I'm going in here, I've got all kinds of views set up. You might have seen in the views folder, I had a whole bunch already set up. So I can go in and get at that different data. Now, when I was working on these demos at home, I was having a huge problem every time I clicked on save. Every single time. It didn't seem to be happening on my computer and on my deployed app. But on this laptop, I wasn't having the problem, which is really interesting. So I can see that that's working. I just changed the blogger name to Julia. That's my name when I'm in trouble, my real name. You might have noticed I had a line of code commented out. This is something, it took getting on live meeting with two guys from Microsoft before they were able to tell me this workaround. It's a workaround. The problem that I was having, and again, I just want to get this in your head so if you have the problem, you might remember this conversation, this one-way conversation, which is that there are some scenarios with data services where it will accept a post. Post is an insert and a get, but it won't accept put, delete, and merge. So put and merge are for updates and deletes are for deletes. And the team, actually the data services team, built this workaround called use post tunneling. And what that does is it tells the context to trick the service into thinking it's going to do an insert, so it gets past whatever that point is that it was saying, no, I'm not doing that, I don't accept posts. And then it lets you get through that. And then when it gets to the other side, it goes, ha-ha, I was doing an edit, right? And so it works. So there's sometimes when you need it and sometimes when you don't. So what we're seeing here now, the last thing I said I wanted to just show you was really for switching from here to using solution, view solution. Where is my solution? Thank you. To using the SQL Azure database instead of my local database is simply a matter of changing the connection string. You can see I have it commented out here. But here's the connections, the green, this one down here. This is my connection string that's pointing to my SQL data service. Since the internet is looking really good right now, maybe I'll just run that one and then you can run out the door. Do you want to see it against this, at least that against the cloud? And that's just because the internet is maybe hopefully not tricking me into thinking that life is good. So I'll comment that out. We'll uncomment this. Now I actually have done this a few times. I'm not going to do it right now. I've done this a few times where I deleted the database, the SQL Azure database. I still want to show you that. Database. Come quickly. Oh, no, those are my IPs. Okay, so the database is here. I'm not going to chance it after what I was having with a SQL Server. But if I deleted that database, what would happen is code first would go, oh, the database doesn't exist yet, and it would create it for me. I've got the connection string, so it knows where I want it to do it, and it knows that I want it to be called blog data. So it can actually, code first can actually create that database even in SQL Azure. It knows how to do it. It's just all the same as far as it's concerned. So go ahead and run this. I stopped it. I changed the connection string. So the whole thing isn't deployed to the cloud, but this is the service still pointing to the SQL Azure database in the cloud. And you get the flavor of all of the pieces and all of the layers of starting with the code first classes, adding the data service, adding the DB context to manage the classes, and then telling the data service about it, adding the MVC Azure project and the role inside of it, and then having the Azure consume the service. And so there that is now. Remember, I just, in the local database, I had changed my blogger name to Julia, and now it's back to Julie. So that's one little bit of evidence for me that it's pointing somewhere else. Okay, so this was a huge, it would have taken a lot more time to code it up all live. But this was, we just put 5 different technologies together, right? The Entity Framework with a new code first. We've got OData and data services. We've got Windows Azure the applications will be hosted in Windows Azure, and they're all pointing to the SQL Azure database. And Windows Azure and SQL Azure were definitely designed to work together. They're designed that way. So these they're really efficient this way. If you hosted this application on your own service, like I have now, right? The application's on my server, the data's in the cloud, then you're going to have some latency between that in your application. But if everything's up there, you don't have that kind of latency because they're all kind of in the same place, just as long as you have them in the servers that are in the same location of the world. So that's what I wanted to show you. I would love to have shown you it working against my SQL Server, but it's being naughty today. And I hope that you're inspired to start looking at some of these technologies. And if you have any questions, are you next? All right, well, come on down, Gary. So if you have any questions, I'm easy to find on Google. I'll be around this afternoon and tomorrow, although I'm doing another session at 5 o'clock. So do you like my pink application?
That is awesome.
Really pink. All right, so that's it. Thanks so much.